Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crystal Drakes, and I will be presenting to you this afternoon Disruptive Doughnuts. My background is I am a PhD student at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Environmental Studies at UWI Caveville campus. I am also a core member of Regenerate Barbados, which is a local civil society organization here in Barbados that is trying to implement Doughnut Economics principles at the community level. And I am also a co-founder of Blue Green Initiative, Inc., which is an environmental NGO here in Barbados that seeks to pilot and test a lot of sustainability projects here on the ground that redound to the benefit of those in our society. So we have these current challenges. We have the climate crisis, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and both of these are what I call symptoms of the core problem. The core problem is really the economic system because a lot of the effects that we are seeing through things like the climate crisis and to some extent the COVID-19 pandemic is really based on how we as human beings are trying to satisfy our needs and wants through an economic system, as I said, that is based on 20th century constructs. So most of our production systems are linear in nature. We also have this concept that once the economy continues to grow, all will be well. So we are basing a lot of the economic production that we have on this concept of perpetual growth. The environment is also seen as an external factor that we are not concerned in a way that it really should be in terms of economic policy, and it also ignores the biophysical limits by which the economic system in and of itself is a subsystem of that larger biophysical environment, and that is all based on what I call 20th century economic thinking. And now that the world is faced with the climate crisis, which we are seeing unfold rapidly at the moment, and then things like the COVID-19 pandemic, which is really showing up the structural inefficiencies and inequalities in our society, there's clearly also then a need for the economic system to distribute a lot more value to a larger subset of those persons in our societies. So how did we get here? After the Great Depression, which was throughout the 1930s and the 1940s, the US sought to value or account for a lot of the economic activity that was happening in their society. And Simon Kuznets came up with gross domestic product as that metric that would account for all of the investment and the income that was happening at the time. And it was actually said that gross domestic product was the soul of the economy. And what that led to is because gross domestic product basically looked at, the amount of production that was happening, the amount of income that was being generated, the amount of value that was coming into the economy on basic material terms. Things like environmental costs, social costs were not included in the gross domestic product calculation. And because we based our economy on gross domestic product, then things like material consumption were rewarded. And that increased consumption at the household level, bringing persons out of poverty and increasing their social mobility, did come at the expense of environmental degradation that, again, was not accounted for. But as we moved further along, a lot of ecological economists realized that the construct of gross domestic product had its limits, and not just its limits in terms of how we were measuring the economy, but the economic system itself. Donella Meadows in the 1970s put out what I call one of the pivotal works of ecological economics called Limits to Growth, really starting to highlight this issue of the economy ever expanding and basically butting up against a lot of the ecological limits that were happening in society. But throughout the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, most of that type of conversation that the ecological economists were trying to have, saying, there is something inherently wrong with an economy that is ever expanding, that is part of a larger system that is basically stable and needs certain balances to occur for it to be sustainable. And then we have the post-2000 era. We had the Great Recession in 2008, and coming out of that, we saw a move towards the green economy and the need for the substitution of fossil fuel energy-based systems to be swapped with renewable energy based systems. And continually throughout the 2000s, the early 2000s, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, continued to put out their reports with these warnings saying, the current economic system is really and truly in conflict with the environmental and the climate systems that the earth has, which are not growing, but in fact, they work in balance, and we need to kind of figure out a way by which we bring a lot of the effects of our production and our consumption back in line. And then, of course, we had COVID in 2020, which saw the greatest wealth transfer. And what that then highlighted to many persons is how precarious a lot of our livelihoods are, and the need for the economic system to have some greater level of social protection in place for those of us who are below the poverty line or just about, and now even the middle class, because with that transfer of wealth, it means that more persons are susceptible to poverty. And all of this through the 1930s up to where we are now has led to some serious climate and ecological issues. We are moving, I think at the moment we are at 1.2 degrees global warming above pre-industrial levels. 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is set to happen within the next 2 decades. I think that will come even earlier if major transformation does not happen within the economic policy space at a global level. We also have rising sea levels. There's a smaller Arctic coverage, and that is a clear indication as well of the feedback loops that happen within the environment, because as the earth warms, we are having smaller Arctic coverage, and the amount of sunlight then that is reflected off of the earth is actually limited, and the earth is absorbing more sunlight as the Arctic cover continues to shrink, enhancing and speeding up the amount of warming that is happening. We also, as I said, ocean warming and acidification, which has clear impacts on the resources, our marine resources, which are fundamental to our way of life and how habitable the earth is, as well as these extreme weather events. And we in the region, we are very cognizant of how much stronger and how frequent these storms are coming and having an impact on our societies. And all of this is based on, as I said, the 20th century thinking around economics and our society, and it's based on, a neoliberal paradigm where we're seen as very individualistic. We are very concerned about material consumption, and there's very little value placed on in things like environmental stewardship, social responsibility. Those things have crept in the last, I want to say, 20 to 30 years, but they aren't central to our economic system and our social systems. We are still very much based on material consumption as our target of prosperity and wealth. So if the neoliberal paradigm is failing us, given the current challenges that we have in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis that are going to be at the forefront of our 21st century reality. There needs to be a new paradigm. We need to have new economic thinking that addresses these current challenges in a way that solves them at a level where the environment is being preserved for future generations and current generations as well, because given the rate of exploitation of a lot of our resources, there are certain things that even in our lifetime will become challenging as it relates to the availability of resources. And also, how do we construct a society or an economy that serves a larger part of our society? And one of the new paradigms that is gaining a lot of ground is Doughnut Economics. Doughnut Economics was put forward by Kate Raworth, who essentially started to ponder about these issues, and she came up with this concept of Doughnut Economics. Doughnut Economics, first and foremost, is based on ecological economics, and it is driven to counter a lot of that neoliberal and neoclassical economics that relies heavily on perpetual growth. And when Kate Raworth was thinking about this concept of a new economic paradigm, she acknowledged that there were these planetary boundaries that kept the earth habitable. And those are identified in her ecological ceiling that is shown here on the right as climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, air pollution, land conversion, biodiversity loss. And she recognized that if we overshot any of those areas, then that would trigger certain changes within our biosphere that would then deem the earth at risk for being uninhabitable anymore. And then on top of the boundaries or the ecological ceiling by which the economy and the society have to live in, she also recognized through a lot of these sustainable development goals that there are these inherent social needs and inequities that need to be addressed for all to thrive. And she recognized that that was the social floor, the social foundation by which the economy needs to be designed in a way that no one falls short of having access to these basic needs. And she identified things like water, food, health, education, housing, networks, social equity. And she then put those two concepts together, this concept of an ecological ceiling and a social foundation by which the economy then has to become designed to exist in a safe and just space for humanity, which is in the middle of that ecological ceiling and that social floor. And then she realized that there needs to be some type of regenerative and distributive economy. Regenerative in a way that it allows for the ecological systems and the climate systems to regenerate themselves. We have to move away from being degenerative in the way that in the way that our economic systems are designed, and then the economic system also has to be distributive in nature. What that means is, again, that she thought of the need of the values associated, the value creation that is made within the economic system has to be spread more equitably across societies. And that is how she came up with the concept of a donut economy, where the economy is operating below the ecological ceiling, but it is also operating at a place where most persons, all persons, are above that social floor. So Doughnut Economics is based on Saturn principles. So the question then becomes, how do we move from that neoliberal, neoclassical type of economics to one of the donut? What are the things that drive this transformation towards moving from, the degenerative and exploitive nature of our economic system? Those 7 principles, the first being we have to change the goal. We have to move away from gross domestic product And that metric that does not account for environmental costs, it doesn't account for the social costs, and it also doesn't capture very well either the environmental assets that we have and the things that actually make the economy work. So we have to find a new metric that allows us to understand where we are in relation to the safe and just space. There are many indices, sustainability indices that are out there already, but for some reason they have not been picked up by a lot of our policymakers and those in the political space. So we have to change the goal from GDP. GDP is no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. We have to see the big picture. The economic system is not just an isolated market that, we engage in it without having some connection to the environmental and biophysical system. So it is an embedded, we have to see it as an embedded economy that takes energy and materials from the natural environment. We transform them to satisfy our own needs and our wants through consumption and production practices, and then a lot of it that we produce and consume, whether it's through the byproducts of the production system, whether it's through waste after we've consumed products, they go back into the environment, and they cannot be upcycled in a way that the resources are reused. So we have to see it as an embedded economy to change the linear production systems to circular production systems. We also have to see man moving away from just being this rational economic man that is self-interested and is only driven by material possession. We have to see ourselves as being socially adaptable human beings. We take up different roles in society. We are community caretakers, we are family members. There are other social aspects to our life outside of just being labor for the economic system. So we have to view ourselves in a more dynamic way, I would say. The fourth principle is that we have to move away from the concept of mechanical equilibrium, where there's demand, there's supply, and at some point the market settles at a price. And understanding that there's a lot more complexity that is happening within both the economic system and the environmental system and the social system. And once we start to see the interconnections, I think that is where we have to go in terms of our systems thinking, the interconnections that are happening. We would then get a better idea of the decisions that we're taking in the economic systems and how they then impact the social system and the environmental system. She then says the fifth principle is to design to distribute and to move away from the concept that growth will eventually distribute income. And we know a perfect example is the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw even when the economy was contracting in the way that it did and continues to do so, a lot of the wealth was distributed to those in the higher echelons of our society, who people call the 1%. And we have to find a way that we distribute the value and the income in our societies, that more persons are beneficiaries of that value. And then we have to create to regenerate. And this is looking at the environment and the systems that we have. So moving away from that linear production system, as I said earlier, and the concept that once we reach a certain level of gross domestic product, the economy will become sophisticated enough to clean up the environment. And we know that that is also not happening based on what is occurring in the climate crisis and this issue of greenhouse gases, as well as the overexploitation of resources and the degenerative impact that we're having on a lot of species around the world, a lot of local habitats being lost because of how the economy is designed. And then 7, which is probably the most controversial concept, is you have to become agnostic about growth. There are some nuances to this where those who are in quote unquote developed countries are now being asked to assign to themselves this concept of either a degrowth strategy or an A growth strategy, where if you have enough income within your societies, then the goal is not to attain more, but have a better quality of life. And that is what the move away from gross domestic products to a new metric should ensure, because now you're measuring your society, you're measuring your economy, not just on more consumption, more investment, but the better quality of life that is what you're trying to achieve in your society. And if we look at the just GDP growth, and I like this slide because if we look at just gross domestic product, globally, we say, you know, we have an $84 trillion global economy. But if we look at the global economy based on the donut, then we clearly see that we are overshooting four planetary boundaries already: climate change, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, land conversion, and biodiversity loss. And we are actually in a shortfall on all of our social foundation domains. So whether it's water, food, health, social equity, political voice, across the globe, we are in a shortfall. So the question has to become, how do we transform that economy that is primarily encapsulated as a $84 trillion economy? How do we then transform that into a system that, one, brings us back in line, brings us back within our ecological ceiling, while at the same time enhancing life for many persons across the globe where there are social inequities. In the Caribbean, we are no different. There was some work done by Robin Mahan at the Center for Environmental Resources here at Cave Hill. He then adapted the Doughnut Economics framework to Barbados, and he found that even in Barbados, our CO2 emissions per capita are way above the standard or the accepted levels. Our material footprint is also being overshot, and our ecological footprint is also being overshot, and we're just about starting to overshoot our nitrogen levels as well. A lot of the social foundation aspects have not been captured because the data is simply not there, and that's also another area where we have to enhance our data collection in terms of, you know, if we're looking forward now to a better quality of life, we need to have indicators and metrics that allow us to see where we're going, where we're falling short. And this was done pre-pandemic. So things like even before the pandemic, we were falling short in terms of employment and equality, but we were doing well in things like energy and sanitation and education, of course, because of a lot of the monies that are placed into those types of areas here in Barbados. And some work has also been done on some other Caribbean countries, Trinidad and Tobago, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica. When we look at these economies based on the Doughnut Economics framework, we saw that none of the Caribbean countries in the study resided within the donut. And Trinidad, the DOMREP, and Jamaica exceeded at least 3 of the 7 planetary boundaries, particularly phosphorus, CO2 emissions, material footprint, and the ecological footprint in some instances. And what was also found is that none of the Caribbean countries in this study achieved half of the social needs within their society. So there's a lot of work to be done if we start to look at the Caribbean within the Doughnut Economics framework. And in the 21st century, I mean, this is a future that is going to be very different from the 20th century. There are going to be high levels of uncertainty and volatility within our societies, given how interconnected we are at the moment, and the fragility of our ecological systems and our climate systems. And the problems will not be linear or simple in context, but very complex. And we are going to have to find solutions that are multifaceted to address this complexity. And we then obviously have to start thinking in terms of systems. When we are assigning a lot of our policy prescriptions and our businesses, we have to then think of what is the system that we are trying to fix, what are the elements that exist in that system, and what are the relationships and the possible feedback loops. And we have to embed all of this in a sustainability concept, irrespective of if it's economic, environmental, or social. And then we have sustainability in finance. And the concept of being unsustainable will have a lot of impact on the financial system, in terms of the climate impacts, resource exploitation. They all are going to impact the economic activity, and because they are going to impact the economic activity and our ability to produce and consume, then it will obviously impact the financial system as well. And when you have issues like, let's say, for instance, hurricanes, what that does is then it has an impact then on the amount of your infrastructure, your physical assets, and these things cannot be decoupled. These effects cannot be decoupled from the economy itself and the ability for us to produce value or more business within our societies. They are going to act as hindrances and obstacles. And what is also going to happen is, once these inequities within our system also continue to intensify, the social tension and dislocation that is going to happen will also create greater instability within the economic and the financial systems. And we all know that the Caribbean is on the front line of the climate crisis. Things like climate migration will have an impact on the economic systems. When we look at Dominica losing almost 200% of its GDP when Hurricane Maria struck, these are all things that we have to take into account when we are designing things like financial instruments, when we are designing economic policy. They are not set apart and separate from the economic and financial realities. And obviously, this concept of high debt to GDP levels that we have will also play a part in the amount of policy space that we have. So we are going to have to rely on the business community to kind of step up and try to bridge the gap between the financing that is needed to transition towards sustainability, in addition to the governments, who are also going to have to come up with innovative ways to finance a lot of these sustainability and adaptation and resilience measures that are going to be needed for us to survive and then somehow thrive in a 21st century world. The issue also of finite and natural human resources has to also come into play. A lot of our economies here in the region are based on, sun, sea, and sand, the tourism product, and we know that once there is a level of degradation within our environment, then we've also put at risk our main economic earners like tourism. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has shown how precarious that industry is. And then we also have finite human resources. So we have to find a way in which we organize our human resources here in the Caribbean to maximize the sustainability goals or optimum that we're trying to achieve. So given that there is clearly an interconnection between what happens in the environmental and the climate systems, there then needs to be a new position for finance, and that is the long view. What has currently obtained under the 20th century paradigm is a short-termist view. And what has happened is unsustainability is not financially sustainable, as I've articulated in the previous slide. All of those things that are interconnected to the economic system and the financial systems will then have some negative impact on the financial viability of a lot of our markets. And then also the environmental and the social costs are external from firms' bottom lines. And that concept as well is changing slowly, but many of our firms and the profitability of our firms are still very much embedded in the economic bottom line of profitability. And those are, as I said, short-termist views. And what has to happen is those in the financial sectors need to then move from the short-term view to the long view. So moving away from the profit-driven bottom line now to a triple bottom line, where you have your environmental, social, and economic bottom lines, where you then start to gauge how well a company is doing, not just on the profitability front, but how are they embedded in their community, what type of corporate social responsibility do they have, as well as their, let's say, ecological or their material footprint, and what kind of impact does that business have on the environment. So a triple bottom line view is a better view to have when looking at how are we financing a lot of the businesses going forward. And things like the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance principles, can help a lot of the businesses at the moment kind of start to transition from that short-term view to the long-term view. And we have to also look at how can businesses measure the environmental and social efficiencies. Most of the time, we just think of efficiencies as in terms of the production of the company, in terms of the capital input and output that is created. But in terms of the environmental and the social efficiencies, we also have to look at how private businesses and things like the investments that we're making in some of these private businesses, how do they measure up against, things like the triple bottom line, ESG principles, and environmental and social efficiency, so that the financial viability of a lot of these businesses and these investments can be long term rather than short term, and then in the long run are become unviable. One of the things I wanted to do is find something that really encapsulates this issue of the short-termist view, particularly in the financial sector. And I was reading the US Financial Stability Oversight Council report on climate change. And this paragraph really stuck out to me in terms of the gravity of the situation that we're dealing with. And it states that the extreme weather and flooding may render regions of the country, meaning the US, too costly to insure, condemning entire communities, households, businesses, and governments alike to economic and financial precarity with unclear options. The mounting toll of physical damages could wipe out the income properties generate or destroy the value of assets used as collateral, posing credit and market risks to banks, insurers, pension plans, and others. And it clearly then, in the context of the US, and if this is the context of the US, you can then imagine, given that the Caribbean is on the front line of climate change and we are dealing with small open economies, what then these climate associated risks are as it relates to our economic prosperity, our economic viability, our economic sustainability, as well as our environmental and our social value systems, as well as our asset base. So we have to think now in the Caribbean, how do we account for these issues that are happening across the board as it relates to sustainability and climate change in terms of the credit and the market risk associated with the banks in the region? How does it relate to things like our pension plans and the impact that the issues will have on the ability to provide social protection measures, whether they're private or public instruments, to the wider society. And I think that is a conversation that I don't know if it has started within places like the Actuarial Association in the Caribbean, but we really have to start thinking differently about our financial instruments, our markets, and how they're related to these environmental and social challenges that we're going to have in the 21st century. One of the ways by which we can start to have that conversation and I think of it in three ways. You know, once we acknowledge that we have to embed the economy within nature, we then have to notice that the purpose of business, the purpose of business has to be about creating economic value, social equity, and environmental sustainability, and not just this very sterile modeling that we do at the moment, and acknowledge that modeling is one part. And I know actuaries do a lot of modeling, so do economists, but we have to get away from this concept that modeling is going to solve the problems, or modeling is the solution to the problem, and acknowledging that is only part of the solution. We have to now get back to a place where there's a philosophical and there's a moral basis for that modeling and the decision making that we're taking, and not just be driven by, what I call the crunching of the numbers. The crunching of the numbers has to be driven by some philosophical and moral grounding. And then thirdly, the investment principles of institutional investors should be aligned clearly, to promote sustainability. And particularly in finance and in relation to the climate, we have to start assessing climate related financial risks to financial stability. We have to enhance climate related disclosures to investors, market participants, so that that type of information is given to them so that they can make better decisions, they can make informed decisions. And then we have to enhance the actionable climate related data. I spoke about that earlier as well, to allow for better risk management. And we have to build the capacity to ensure that the climate related financial risks are managed and identified in a way that we can incorporate them into our decision making for long-term strategies, for long-term investments, and also identifying those investment instruments that meet the criteria for sustainability. So I've said a lot, and I really want to thank you for joining me in this session. But I just want to leave with you, after everything that I've said about doughnut economics and this urgent need for us as a human race, and I'll say that without any fear, as us as a human race, and even more urgent for us here in the Caribbean, to ask you, what are you doing as an actuary, as an economist, as a financial advisor? Is my work contributing towards an unsustainable future, or an unsustainable or a more sustainable world? And I think that is a question that when we work within our various professions, we have to start asking ourselves, and then making the conscious effort to start to embed a lot more of these sustainability principles and paradigms like doughnut economics into our work, if we want a better future, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. And I just want to thank you all for listening to me. And I am open now for questions, comments, and any discussion that the participants may have at this time. Thank you so much.